Good morning. Michael Fisher here. Well, the big question on my mind is, who do you listen to? What do you listen to? When do you listen to? And how much do you listen to? And will contribute to the conversation on climate change, really climate crisis, some call emergency, and the global warming problem, if we could summarize that. And even that is all controversial, as you may know. If you don't know, if you spend any time looking and addressing at this issue and question of this macro scale, what's going on the planet regarding ecological problems, environmental problems, now being captured, almost all of those ecological environmental problems captured by the attention given to, from a fearologist point of view, would be the fear of what is going on in the climate, in the weather, and the crises, cataclysmic kinds of proportions of damages to human and other species. And, I could list all those, from fires to floods to temperatures rising and becoming unbearable in many parts of the world, drying up and desertification. So this all goes back to my own interest in how now do I bring a study of fearology and all the methodology of fear analysis, critical fear analysis, to this ongoing, really one of the greatest human dilemmas ever, is to try to even decide on what is actually happening. Of course, right? Like, there's all those symptoms of things we could more or less say, well, we see it in the media, we see the events, we may live and experience the events. We know people and children are having to migrate because of places that they live becoming uninhabitable, ecologically and, of course, culturally, through wars and violence and so on. So it's not like we don't see the symptoms, but the real problem that I want to address this morning is, how do we actually make sense as a human being and as a professional educator, say psychotherapist, theologian, whatever, and how do we make then decisions upon how we make sense of the reality going on? And how do we actually then affect and determine our relationship to nature, to the environment, to culture, to civilization, to the future? Well, that's a whole lot to take on, and there's some people, and I can feel that sometimes myself, is, oh, well, right now, today, I've kind of got enough on my mind. I just have got to try to figure out how to keep this job, or try to find out how to get a job, or just to survive under the strains and stresses of the day. So no thanks. You people can go look at climate change and crisis and what we're supposed to do about it, and all your great theorizing or whatever, write some books or do videos and teach. And governments, of course, are making policies now about greening and the Green New Deal, and what we should do as consumers. Should we be paying this carbon tax on our use of gasoline and our heavy driving of the automobile that many do not want to change? So we're talking about, and I'm talking about, as a fearologist, I have to examine, I think we all have to examine, more or less, again, systematically or just maybe even casually, how do we make sense of the growing amount of fear, and how do we even recognize it, and how are we handling it? By denial and pretending we don't know, or just saying we don't have the bandwidth, right? We don't have the free attention to actually take that in right now. And some people call that the window of tolerance, or the resilience zone that we have is just a little too shrunk. Right now, I can't handle anything outside of my comfort zone, into the stretch zone. And of course, the panic zone is right sitting there, as some psychologists say, especially with this issue, and especially when we think about children, and not just, ideas about the future. I'm talking about the real people that are really suffering today, and in fact dying, arguably, as Greta Thunberg and others would argue, are dying right now because of inaction on climate change, and particularly the one that gets the most attention is carbon dioxide outputs from human activity. So I'm just going to give a little story, and then I'm going to tell you how I kind of got into climate change and crisis through my own autobiography briefly, and then how today I have to make decisions about what is the story I understand. And that's how I'm interested in framing the whole thing. What is the story that we're creating? As I'll get back to that book by Charles Eisenstein in a moment, one that I happen to think is a really wise approach. Not that I agree with everything in there. Wise approach in that we frame the problems of human civilization, life, this cosmos, our relationship to the cosmos within a sense of a story. So we'll get to that in a moment, but here's a real story. So I'm on the train. I'm going down to the art studio yesterday morning, cold, snowy morning, and I get on the train, and there's like a field trip going on with several teachers, and seem to be students from about 9-10-year-olds all the way up into their teens, early teens. And apparently they're going on a field trip to the zoo, as I found out, and just kind of listened silently, and the train's rolling along. And then I noticed one passenger who was not related to this group got into a conversation with one of the teachers. A young male teacher, seemed very enthusiastic and a lot of good energy, and he was really listening to this older man. And the older man was just going on and on with great anger and resentment, sense of betrayal, and grief, I will add, about both Alberta politics, the federal politics, the federal leader. He was obviously not happy with the Liberals. And he then went on to tell this teacher about, their financial problems in schools, the budget cuts that are going on. And he was very articulate, and the teacher was sort of overwhelmed. And then the older gentleman, with all his anger, got into, and these children that you have with you today are going to suffer the consequences of all our bad decisions that we're making as adults right now. And he was particularly of the boomer generation, but even of the adults who are the teachers, and how they're handling the world and making certain choices to do certain things. And all the time I was sitting there, I was very impressed with the teacher being able to handle all that. And certainly you could feel that teacher's distress as he said a few comments. But most important, as I looked to the side, there were 2, 3, 4 students, again, in this sort of 10-year-old to early teens, and they were listening like intimately to every detail of that exchange. And that was the story, you see, that they're getting. And that's what I'm really concerned about, both as an educator, as a fearologist, as someone who's done psychotherapeutic work, someone who does therapy now for family systems. And I'm really a cultural therapist in another way, is people are building stories and they're hearing stories. I'm sure most everyone nowadays, whether you're on the bus or whether you're with some people or in a room or wherever on the streets even, you're going to hear stories about this climate crisis, about the future, the precarity and danger of what's coming, and the challenges and difficulties that these children are picking up. Obviously the anger of adults and the sense of betrayal, their fear, and of course that is going to bring up all the same kinds of emotions, more or less echoed in those children, those young people, of the youth. So I sort of call all of that in a narrative of the sense of collapse, the sky is falling kind of metaphor, and not metaphor, perhaps is very real and imminently real, of what is even being called today. I was just listening to a video, collapse awareness in collapse psychology, the kind of psychology of mental health issues in terms of both impending and real disasters of all kinds, of these mega proportions. So it's a kind of new approach to how are we going to raise and tell stories around children and youth. And in this case, it was very unconscious, right? It's just these adults going at it. And, even the teacher said, yeah, it's going to be disastrous or something like that for the future of the kids. And again, I'm just watching the kids trying to process that, and that teacher not really being able to turn around and think, okay, whoa, you've got a whole bunch of people listening to you because you're such an important figure in their life, more or less, quote, an authority. And I just thought that's exactly how the climate change crisis, emergency, whatever you call it, on global warming is going to be spreading through these stories within what is called social discourse. That is the way we talk, the way we write, the way we think, and the way we relate to each other in social interactions on very micro level to larger scale group and institutional and macro levels when you get into media and world conversations and arguments. And all of it arguably is part of a traumatic network. It's part of a traumatizing, a terrorizing, if you will. And I could just as well say a fearizing, which I prefer, of this subtle form of a kind of fearism, an ideology of an ideological toxic fearism that is breeding, that builds a kind of subtle sense of terrorism as ideological. What do I mean by ideological? It's within social discourses and belief systems and ideas that these people have put together, this older man angry and this teacher listening and reinforcing a lot of his ideas, and that they created this kind of emotional climate, right? A fear, arguably, hungering, if not just fear invoking, even unconsciously, within social space, within social discourse, right? That then spreads because of the authority of certain figures to others who are listening. Children mostly listening a lot to adults, more or less, if they don't have their sets on. That's how the story spreads. So then you come to the notion, well, how are we going to do the education, and how do I negotiate? So let me get to how I got educated on, and then my decision that I've come to, which I want to share with you today, that will maybe provide you some maybe more balanced or more perspectives, or may piss you off, the way I understand and want to make sense of the story. So through a process of becoming conscious of the narratives of the social discourse and the role of fear. So when I was in my teens, I've maybe said this at different times in some of my teaching videos. I became aware of environmental problems because I was a fisherman and my dad was a fisherman, and that was really core to our family's outings on every Sunday. And so I learned very early to both respect the farming world, because my dad came from that farming world, and I had some cousins and relatives, and we visited the farm and loved those experiences as children. And it was a small hobby farm kind of thing. Not hobby farm, but a small milking farm of mixed activities. Not like the big corporate farming. And then fishing, a little bit of hunting, but not very important in the hunting world. My dad was really a fisherman. So that was really, for me, it was really gentle, even though there's a certain kind of violent elements of killing it. But I think when you do that respectfully, as the indigenous people have forever when they have killed game, and that you learn that it's a very respectful approach to taking life of others and realizing that all life that comes to me, all food comes to me, comes through the sacrifice of another life. I learned those laws, I learned those principles, I learned how to be in nature and not spoil it so that the fish will be good in the next year. Don't take too many, don't leave your garbage and dump your waste into the rivers and the streams and lakes, etc. But when I experienced the first pollution in the fish that we were catching, which was from oil and gas industry here in Alberta area, that was very distressing when I was about 14. And very distressing to all of us. And then it became harder and harder to find places to go fishing that weren't polluted by excess cattle and soil erosion, the waste from cattle farms and from oil and gas industry, particularly those two, and then just general acidification due to increasing carbon dioxide in the air and more acidic rain coming down, and all the fertilizers and pesticides that were going into agricultural systems and or just roadside systems to keep the shrubs down, to kill weeds, to you name it, right? It's like these are all part of what I was learning and grew up in, and it was harder and harder to find these, really healthy areas. And I was aware of that, even though I was not an environmentalist per se. I didn't even know what ecology was. But my career, to say in the early 20s, was to first go into what I call forestry. And then it became, well, no, really, I want to go and just, I love being in nature and the wilds. So I went into wildlife technician, biology, environmentalism. And I won't go through that career. That was a very important part of shaping my life and my attitudes. And obviously then went in more into psychology and spirituality and therapy and education and rehabilitation and counseling. And so it was hard to get back to all my interests in ecology, but now they're all coming back, because 30 years later, the environmental issues are so severe now, actually 40 years later. And I have to now come back to look at applying all this that I've learned about my own healing and how humans heal and groups operate and social discourse, right? And all these functions of our mental health and psychology, and how that now relates to the ecological. So I sometimes call that the ecological journey I went on in career, which is about the sense of self in relation to the world. And the ecological journey is self in relationship to the natural world. So kind of the cultural world through the ecological, and the ecological more with their relationship to the natural, and now bringing those together into integrated or critical integral approach to life and Fearology. That's the nutshell. I know that's kind of a lot to take in, but it's important in setting the field, right? The ground, the platforming for how I now have to make meaning. So everyone's going to have their own way of bringing their backgrounds, and I ask you to take a look at your own autobiography, really is what I'm doing this morning. And then take a look at what you've been reading, what you've been thinking, what kind of stories you've heard from the adults over your lifetime. And take some time on that as we come and you come, as whatever your position is in life. Maybe it's a parent, and that's enough for you to deal with children, and or you have grandchildren or nieces or nephews, and whatever the case may be. Our relationships within this social world of how we're going to tell stories about making sense of the crises going on of some kind. And if it isn't a crisis, and maybe we're exaggerating the sky is falling, which is a possibility, then just how do we help tell stories about when we hear those stories, right? So again, that teacher could have mediated after with those children and youth about that interchange with that old man, because they heard it, and that teacher ideally probably didn't do it because of the situation they were in, could have mediated and had a learning session and asked questions around how the children perceived what was going on in that dialogue, right? That social conversation, that making of meaning of the world, and basically placing children and categorizing them as they're going to suffer the consequences of our decisions today. True. And of course, it's not only suffer, that what is their opportunity that goes with what they are having to deal with as challenges regarding their relationship to the future and the environment and the economy. All of that stirs around to how I make decisions. And obviously I study now more and more, and I haven't for a lot of years, the global warming problem. And I'll just put it in that for a moment, that frame, because that's what I learned when I started going to college, right, at 20 years old. That was in the textbooks. So we're talking 1972. My very first post-secondary education, and I just got flooded and was curious and read and took courses, and the environmental issues grew and grew up into the late 70s when I was taking environmental biology at the University of Calgary in an undergrad. And it was unavoidable that the global warming effect, this greenhouse effect as it was called back then, and still is somewhat today, was going to definitely cause a lot of problems. Now, the science on it at that time, there wasn't a lot of questioning about it. It was kind of like, it's just going to happen and be prepared. This is how it looks. And we have to cut down air pollution problems and, lower the carbon dioxide and use less energy, right? Less ecological footprint. But all the time, nobody is really talking about how to improve the ecological footprint, lower the ecological footprint, which is, I call the fear-based footprint, and create a more healthy ego self in relationship to nature and the natural world of our community of relationship with all beings, not just humans. So getting away from a more anthropocentric worldview to a more world-centric, natural, and cosmocentric worldview, sometimes put under the lens of building sustainability attitudes and mentality and so on. So I was interested in emotional resilience, and early, even in those educational days when I became a teacher, because I went into environmental education. So all of those study and thinking, again, the science of global warming and ecological crises were sort of coming out, but there wasn't a lot of challenges. There was some backlash challenges, not just from people who didn't want to hear about the environment and the ecological fear terror that was potentially we're going to face in the future, very near future. But the scientists of different, ilk and different ways of assessing data on climate and ecological issues even, there was some debate, but it wasn't like it is now. So nowadays, for sure, in the last 10 years particularly, last 5 years particularly, even more, we cannot ignore now that there's such a psychological debate and conflict and wars, really, at some level, over what the story is about what the science says and how you interpret the facts, and then meaning of those facts, and then what we should do in terms of making policy, in terms of educating. What do we educate our next generations on? What do they need to know to negotiate that kind of features? Because they're going to hear the stories, right, in social discourse. So how are we going to help them negotiate, make meaning of that without freaking them out, right? Getting people into such an uncomfortable level of hearing such imposing and ominous stories and feeling the fear and the anger and the emotionality, the sense of even despair and grief, sense of helplessness that many people, many feel around this issue. That's just been shown over and over if you ask people about how they feel and what they think about the future of the world. It's a pretty glim for the most part in the last surveys of the last few years. I won't go into those details other than many have argued that what we now need to look at, and that's where my angle is not so much on the debates on science, because I take the position I'm going to go into the mental health side of the problem of global issues and environmental. But I was interested in Charles Eisenstein because he really sincerely wanted to study the science of climate change, so spent years. And he's not a scientist per se, but he's a mathematician, and he's a very sharp dude. Gen X or Gen Y kind of guy. And he really said at the end, after studying all that, he says, I really wanted to be, a faithful climate advocate, and I couldn't stand the climate deniers. I thought they were, because he was part of that conflict. So he had to be on the green side, and he's very much an environmentalist and still is. But he said, I had to be honest with myself in his research that, where it really comes down, it's so complex to understand this global problem, and then how has climate changed historically over time, and what is actually impacting, and what are all the multiple effects and impacts, and then all the multiple interpretations from different kinds of scientists Even the climate scientists don't all agree, even though now we've got 11,000 scientists signing a petition right from through the UN and otherwise saying that, this is a real emergency. And that's what they want us to say, climate emergency that we're facing. But then when you study, as Charles did, and myself and others, more and more, if you're willing to listen to the side that you don't like their story as much about, and you don't like how they interpret the facts as much about, and what facts they use, and then what facts they don't use, and so they have a social discourse of scientists, all of them, no matter what side you're on the debate about this, the conflict about it, the war about this. And it is really important how we figure this out. That conflict is extremely important to figure out, and how are we going to manage it? Conflict management. And with that is fear management underneath, which I'll get to as I end this video. So that's how I've come, even through my science background, and then obviously education, mental health background, and professionally, but just as a citizen as well, an engaged in thinking, critical thinking kind of citizen. How am I making sense of the story is I've come to like Charles Eisenstein say, you can't really easily or even with sustained effort over a long period of time and honest, sincere research into both sides, you can't say one side is right and one side is wrong. To demonize the other, the opposite, the different story, then we have to look for news stories, is what he's basically saying. And try to get down to the more important issues of our relationship to nature. And let's not let climate change, crisis, social discourse, and its politics, the divisiveness of it, often Democratic versus liberal, Republican versus liberal, and so on. Let all that divisiveness become the most important thing. So that's just another tactic he's saying is let's try another story that is maintaining the story. Let's take care of the planet Mother Earth because she takes care of us. And if we get caught up in all of the fight over what are the facts, what aren't around, especially as he says, climate change has kind of hijacked the environmental and the movement, which is hard enough to get people to be on board with and support and maybe make the kind of lifestyle changes that will be less hard, right? Less ecological footprint. And I say less egological footprint because of the fear of trying to protect yourself and keeping the environment away because it's the enemy, which is a long historical social discourse story that still is very powerful and controls a lot of our world today, especially in the modern industrial, post-industrial world. we have a lot of issues there, right? A lot of issues. So you know that, and I just suggest do your homework and listen to both sides of the stories of climate, and don't let it overcome the other issues of environmental. And remember, it's so complex, but also then we have to come to simple notions too to try to make a story. So that's how I'm making a story. So in all that complexity, all that research, and my kind of coming to a big question mark, there's lots I don't know. There's lots of mystery still. That does not mean that I do not have deep grief, sorrow, despair, anger, all of the various kinds of emotions, including the fear experience around the future, and especially as I am very compassionate and empathetic for your youth and children receiving adult stories that adults are not always conscious of passing on to young people, and the effect and impact that has on their mental health. And it's often invisible to see until the symptoms come out as something more horrific, and children start acting out or showing various kinds of unhealthy symptoms, illnesses, and so on. But again, there's many people in the world that are so unfortunate, and the circumstances that they live day to day, the traumatization rates and intensity is it's, it's not even comparable to what I experience or my people I hang around with in North America, particularly, for the most part, on average, right? That we are just so well off compared to. I guess I want to go in a little bit different direction in my story. That's really coming to me just really in the last few days as I think about, you know, collapse aware thinking or trauma informed thinking on this all, and related to emotional development, intelligence, to defense intelligence, and understanding of fear and fearlessness, which I promote a fearlessness psychology, as you may know in some of my videos. So there's a new psychology being asked for, a transformational psychology, a traumatically informed, a resilience-based psychology of a new kind because of this new awareness of potential collapse and extinction and heavily degrees of potential toxicity, right? And sustainability to non-sustainable life on the planet. Again, you can see immediately that starts to become a story, and I can start getting and sounding like that is the story, that is the way it is, and all of a sudden the listener of all kinds could be listening and going, well, I don't buy that story. I don't believe in that assumption. I don't think it is that kind of emergency and crisis and so on and so on. So you see, part of me does and is quite convinced after my long career of 45 plus years, going back to my youth, of studying environmental issues and experiencing real ecological damage ongoing around me and watching a lot of destruction, that I'm not very pleased with human notions and ways of progressing, although there's been obviously good aspects to that progressing, making life easier, more sustainable in terms of my livelihood and how long I can live and my health and so on. You can get into that debate. You know, are we going to a better way? Are we going to a worse way? I generally fall along the line that we're going into a not a good spiral that will challenge and limit our ability to sustain life on this planet in the fairly near future. So I can easily go down that road, and you may or may not disagree with that, right? That's really not the point of the video, because I am also aware that I don't even think that is the story that's most useful, is whether to think we're all going on a good direction, you know, what I call the positive progressive notion of, you know, look what good technology has brought to us, and on we could go. Our systems of capitalism and so on has brought us these great gifts, benefits. Or, you know, we're going down the spiral to hell, and progress is a bunch of bullshit. Okay, so all of the getting outside of that narrative for a while, and what the facts are and aren't the facts, and statistics and such argue, I'm suggesting an interesting narrative, even going beyond, for sure, Charles Eisenstein's approach to the new story around environmentalism, climate, and the future economic systems, is to think more in terms of, I think we could easily divide, let me try and say this in a way that it's hard to even vocalize because I'm so not used to it. I'm just getting some sense of this story of how to talk about it. And it would be interesting, because I want to even think of, what if I had children right now around me, my grandchildren, my nieces and nephews? What if I had family members? What if I had students who were in schools and in universities and colleges sitting around me, as well as maybe just some citizens from our community, as I'm talking, and to actually be aware as I'm talking this narrative, this new story approach, or this just alternative, another story, is what I'm saying. Not all those stories are bad that are existing, and the conflicts I'm not even saying are bad. I just am not satisfied with them from a fearological point of view. And that's often the case of doing fear analysis. I'm not satisfied with how people are trying to solve many kinds of problems, not just this one. So I'm interested in the narrative was coming to me the other day, listening to that story on the LRT train with the children and teacher and the older man. I said, I think really you could sort of divide the spectrum of, climate deniers at the far end to climate advocates, if not extremists at the other end. Along that spectrum, if you to look at the halfway point of when someone goes down that narrative, right, that social discourse down that narrative, social discourse and their interpretation of what's going on in the world in the coming future, near future, I think you could pretty much, let's just go to this side of people moving toward climate denial, so-called, who disagree with the people on that side, that basically those are people who, for very multiple and complex reasons, have a fear to deep terror, anxiety, that could even be so subtle they don't even feel it, that they basically do not want to change, are afraid of change of their already comfortable lifestyle. What's called their psychological comfort zone. They don't want to be stretched a lot into what's called the stretch zone of growth and development. And they don't want to face, because it's panic is the next zone. Those three zones are often used in trauma work and psychology and developmental theories. I like thinking in that way. It's nice and simple, but they just don't want to have their life changed. And they don't want any story from other people who are saying you have to change, you have to drive less, you have to use less carbon footprint and ecological footprint and so on. And if you keep doing that, you're basically going to threaten the lives of the children of the future, and aren't you a horrible person? All that moral imposition as one story goes this way and as their story goes back. Of course, it's not very much different, just a little bit different angle, but it's the same kind of moralizing, demonizing the other side of the story, which is the best story. Well, this is an ancient problem, which is the best story. Humans probably have had to deal with this since the beginning of history and time. Our evolution, going back to when we were able to create stories, then we had to deal with which is the best story. Is the sky really falling, or isn't it? Or is that predator really coming, or is it not coming? Or is this disease really horrible, or is it not? And is it going to spread, or is it not? And yeah, this is not new to make these challenges, but I think what I'm just saying is there's a patterning along the spectrum of possibilities as we come to a relationship with reality. No matter what the problem is or problems we are looking at, the complexities, is that those who do not, that is, those who really fear change out of their comfort zone, out of their privilege, domination, whatever it may be, they just fear that, and that's why they'll even sometimes become so much extreme over here, because they just don't want to change. See, they're going so extreme away from the center because they don't want to interact with the center's information and exchange. They don't want to hear those stories, because if that story is even possibly true, how could their story be possibly true? And then that starts doubt, and then that's the very thing they do not want to experience. So they're kind of people who want to stay in that kind of comfort zone, don't want to the fear of change of their lifestyle. And so I'm just really speaking of people with heavy privilege. Now, I'm not speaking about this applies to everybody. But because I live in North America, that's where I'm most concerned. And in the more developed Western world, particularly because we have such a huge impact on the rest of the climate and economy of the rest of the world. This is where we have to really examine our life here in the West. So the other people are a little more comfortable, a little more or less, to actually make changes going in this direction, which is, yes, I'm willing to give up. I'm willing to change my lifestyle. I'm willing to green. I'm willing to make sacrifices of my very comfortable, privileged lifestyle. A little more, but we don't know how far. you'd have to look at each individual, right, about how willing they are to make how much change, and right to the very far extreme advocates of going to veganism, going to, not taking airplanes or whatever it is, like Greta Thunberg, for example, at 15, 16, she can now make those kind of decisions, but she's then got to live the rest of her life trying to figure out how to make decisions as well. Right now, she's doing it as an adolescent under the care of her family. She's still living under that care and the authority of her family. So adolescents obviously will make more radical decisions, obviously, because they're held up and protected by the system they live in. Although, in many times, the family system they live in is actually not protective of them and can be very harmful. I don't think that's the case at all with Greta, as I've seen and from what I know. But point being is, she's an adolescent. So that is kind of the fear of giving up my lifestyle, and these are who are willing to step into the fear of giving up their lifestyle for what they might call a greater good. And that, all of the things that get flung back of arguments going this way and then flung back going this way, I think are actually a battle around the fear of change, the fear of losing our lifestyle that we're comfortable with. And the sooner we get to a conversation between the sides, and I'm not even saying there's two sides, but there's obviously some kind of two sides to this. There's probably a lot more stories in between that are not so sided, as Charles Eisenstein doesn't really fit one or the other per se, in terms of climate deniers, climate advocates. The exchange, when we get to it finally, and I'm just suggesting we can actually start now doing that because of this thesis I'm putting forward, we can actually say, well, we all don't really like to change our comfort zone when you've been given all these goods. It's just that some of us find that really hard to let go for a lot of fear, and some find it a little less fearful to let go of certain comforts. But I would argue both sides are going to feel a loss. And they feel the pressure of the story of climate crisis emergency, for example. Could be economic crisis, that could be emergency or climate or disaster, collapse. Could be a death diagnosis. Something is going to bring to you and is coming, and more or less you're going to get some kind of information at some point, some kind of diagnosis that's going to disrupt you. And these people are still willing to be disrupted. These are a lot not willing to be disrupted and fight like heck. And yet that's all humanity. That's all parts of our human collective. And to learn to be compassionate with some people take the diagnosis of collapse or death or a disease or whatever it is. We're all susceptible to it. Doesn't matter what side you are, that could come to you, is the fear, right? The terror that can come in with that story of, what your life is no longer going to be able to be the same as it was before. And I know that experience through being diagnosed with arteriosclerosis, heart disease, and having then to make really tough decisions when I thought I was very healthy and living a really great life. And I never wanted to consider too much the problem of just heart disease, which is completely on my father's side, genetically going all the way back. And my brother died of those diseases and so on. Under the conditions, of course, not just the disease, but how people live and lifestyle. So he and I obviously are very different. He was much more this side, I'm much more this side. And I could probably look at all my relationships that way, as people I see who are not really willing to change much of their life. They may talk about climate change or, yes, we really care about these nature perspectives, the indigenous perspective, but really I don't want to change my lifestyle. I really like my upper middle or class or what is lifestyle or whatever, and my beliefs that go with that lifestyle, and so on and so on. And that can even have religious underbeliefs, underbelly beliefs about the world, the nature of the future, the nature of the life after the future. And then there's obviously sometimes different religious or worldviews on either side. But the common ground, as I'm ending this video, is really, I think, to be compassionate with. This is all humans, that we're all going to get diagnosis with the end of time, the kind of collapse narrative of some kind, or a reality even. Things are not going to be the same, and we have to understand some people are more ready to release this way, some are going to be only so ready this way. And so that's kind of the resilience zone that's being talked about in trauma theory, trauma-informed education, and psychotherapy, etc. And mental health is related to our willingness to go in those directions, to make changes that are going to make us more healthy. And that's not just healthy as individuals. Then we have to be able to think for the collective, and that becomes another factor in how much people are willing to go that way or that way. How much do they care about, others in the future? Many complex factors. I'm not trying to use this little formula of fear of change and resilience and capacity to make that fear of change from our comfort zone. I'm not saying that's every factor involved in all the problems of why people divide and become conflicting and warring over certain kinds of ideological positions, religious positions, philosophical positions, and factual stories or stories that they create about the future and what is really going on day to day. Okay, so I'll end it there, and thank you for listening to this. I'd be curious of comments if you find anything useful here. You can see basically I'm looking for more bridging and common ground places as the world wants to divide, and people want to divide, groups want to divide, institutions, countries, nations. How do we not try to get everybody in one story? Not going to happen. We're way too diverse. So that's not a good strategy, but we do have to cooperate. We are social systems, and we are so-called civilized peoples living with under certain kinds of nationhoods and states and all kinds of other arrangements of collective good and struggle politically of how to distribute knowledge, truth, ideas, money, finances, and the gifts that we have to offer to each other. How are we going to distribute those and support and build resiliency and good health physically and mentally and spiritually? That might be an interesting spectrum to look at and an interesting position to look at. So thanks very much. Say goodbye, and let's tune in next time. I'll put up some links underneath this video to some of the people I think are really interesting. Leslie Davenport, just want to mention, as a psychologist looking at the development of resiliency in the time of eco-crisis. And then there's Charles Eisenstein and others. So I'll put up a few links for you if you want to follow some. You can certainly read some of my blogs and my fearlessness movement and others. I'm planning an issue in the International Journal of Fear Studies, which I founded and am now senior editor. The next issue in 2020, sometime in the summer into fall, that issue is going to be guest edited by a couple of people, scholars, and it will be on eco-anxiety, the whole issue of how fear is related to ecological, environmental, and obviously the mental health of the future in this very different time that we're going into, where psychology, therapy, education is going to be challenged and is being challenged to really transform itself to meet these, even if it's not the reality, in fact, the narratives, the social discourses of climate change and emergency. Thanks very much.